Okay, we're going to actually start talking about the Constitution itself, the creation of the Constitution. And we're going to do a little reviewing first. So you need to know that from May 25th of 1787 through September 17th, 1787 was the time that summer that they were working on the Constitution. Just a review of the articles. Remember, the primary purpose of this meeting was to revise the articles. That was the only assignment that they were given. So each state sends delegates to this meeting, and the only instructions that they have are how these states want the Articles of Confederation to be changed. But they realize that as soon as they get there, that this document is so bad and it cannot take care of the problems that we're having. So they decide to completely do away with it. But we have to look at the problems with the articles and remind ourselves of those um, um, before we can actually look at the Constitution. So, under the Articles of Confederation, we have one branch of government. It had a unicameral legislature, which meant it had one house, and each one of those houses got one vote per state. And remember, the name of this legislature is Congress, so that's obviously why we go ahead and use the name Congress when we create our new government. And we are a confederacy. Reminder that the states are sovereign, so we could ask them to do things, but we couldn't force them to do it. There were limited powers that this government could do. They had no power to tax. They could ask, but the states weren't required to. Because they only had one branch of government, they did not have a executive or a judicial branch. They had no power to enforce the laws. Then they also had no power to regulate interstate trade. And then it took 13 of the 13 states, if they wanted to amend them. They were never amended because obviously you're never going to get all 13 states to agree on that. So once again, the original purpose of this meeting was to revise the Articles of Confederation. They meet in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, but only 12 states send delegates with instructions to revise the articles. Rhode Island does not send delegates. Very, very small state, very few people living there. They were very happy the way things were in terms of they are a very small state with no one living there, but their vote in that Congress had the same weight as every other state, so they were not willing to give up that equal representation. And their thought is if we don't attend, it takes all 13 states to amend, so it's not going to happen. So throughout this May to September, 55 men, and not all 55 of them attend at the same time, but there are variations of 55 different men who serve on this convention from May to September. Thomas Jefferson, who is obviously one of our greatest founding fathers, wrote the Declaration of Independence. He actually wasn't there. Once we gain our independence and create this new government, we have ambassadors that we send to other countries. And so Jefferson was actually acting as our ambassador to France. And the same with John Adams, the gentleman that pushes for independence so hard. He is actually our ambassador to Great Britain. So neither one of these great men are attending the Constitutional Convention. George Washington is elected president of the Constitutional Convention, and when you look at that term, president of the Constitutional Convention, that's one of the reasons they went with that term for the President of the United States. It was a term that they were used to at the convention, and so they went ahead and went with that. James Madison is considered the father of our Constitution. James Madison is the only founder or framer of the Constitution, those two words are interchangeable, that attended every single meeting. He was there from start to finish, and he kept word-for-word notes of every meeting. These meetings would be in secret, and the notes that he published, or the notes that he took, were not published until after his death. We have two plans that we need to talk about. The first one is the Virginia Plan, and we talked about most of these gentlemen realized when they got there that the articles were a complete disaster, and one of those was James Madison. James Madison attends this meeting, and he's really the one that calls for this meeting, and he shows up with a plan already in hand. So Edmund Randolph is the one who submits it, but the Virginia Plan is in large part done by George Washington and James Madison. And how they wanted to change the government was, instead of having the one branch, they wanted to create 3 branches of government. They wanted a bicameral legislature, which means we're going to have 2 houses. But they wanted both of those houses based on population. So the larger your state was in terms of population, the more representation you would get in both of those houses. The powers that were going to be given to the national government were the power to tax, the power to enforce laws, and the power to regulate interstate trade. These were 3 of the main problems under the Articles of Confederation. So with this new plan, they were going to take care of all 3 of those problems and give the power to the national government to do all 3 of those things. New Jersey comes along. It's a small state, and remember, under the Articles of Confederation, the small states had the same vote. So the smaller states were not very happy with this Virginia plan because it was giving the larger states with more population more representation. And under the Articles, they're like, why would we give up that equal representation? So they weren't willing to do that. So the New Jersey plan is presented by William Patterson. It proposes 3 branches of government, just like the Virginia plan, but it wanted to keep the unicameral legislature, the one house, and each state would have equal representation. Once again, there was no incentive for them to change that. They have equal representation under the Articles of Confederation, and they are not willing to give that up. They also recognize the need to tax, enforce laws, and to regulate interstate trade, so they provide for that in this new national government. So, the Connecticut Compromise, also known as the Great Compromise, comes up with a way to make these 2 different types of states happy, because this is probably the biggest debate and the issue that they debated over longer than any other one. Representation is crucial. Remember, going back to the Revolutionary War, taxation without representation. You have to have the consent of the people, and one of the primary concerns we're going to find out when we're ratifying the Constitution is representation. So again, major disagreement over representation. So Roger Sherman, and if you remember, he is one of the gentlemen who serves on the committee writing the Declaration of Independence, proposes this Connecticut Compromise. So what he says is we should have 3 branches of government. They all agree on that. And let's go ahead and have a bicameral legislature. But let's have one house, and that would be the House of Representatives. Make sure you know that that is considered the lower house, and that would be based on population. The Senate, which is going to be the upper house, would have equal representation. So each state would get 2 votes in the Senate. So that would look very much like the Congress that they were used to. The Constitution is oftentimes referred to as a bundle of compromises because that's what it is. Almost every issue they had to compromise. You have northern states and southern states. You have some that are more agricultural, some that dealt more in manufacturing. You had slave states and non-slave states. So they really had to work together to try and compromise on all of these issues. One of the main issues was, okay, now we've determined that the House of Representatives is going to be based on population. Now who are we going to count in terms of that population? And there was a big argument over if slaves are property, then they should not be allowed to be counted towards the number of people that live in your state so that you have more representatives. And so that was a big issue between the northern states and the southern states. And so what they decided on was that they would have what's called the 3/5 compromise, where the slaves would be counted as 3/5 of the person, but then the southern states had to pay taxes on those slaves. Another one was trade. They wanted to make sure that when they were exporting or sending their goods to another country, that if we taxed them here, that would make them more expensive once they got to the country that they were going to. So the manufacturing states did not want tax or exports to be taxed, but we want imports to be taxed because goods coming from other countries, we want to make their goods more expensive in relationship to the goods that we make here. So the compromise that they agreed on was that they could tax imports. Goods coming from other countries, we are going to place a tax on that makes them more expensive relative to what we're making. But goods that are made here and exported to other countries, we are not going to tax those. And then the slave trade, which should not be mistaken for slavery itself. The slave trades, importing slaves, from other countries. They decided they were going to do the proverbial kicking the can down the road. We're not going to deal with it now. We'll deal with it in 20 years. So in the Constitution, it literally says that they cannot outlaw the slave trade for 20 years. But the very first thing, 20 years later, when they can, they do outlaw the slave trade in 1808, which interestingly enough, some southern slave states were in favor of eliminating the slave trade. There was a surplus of slaves in these southern states. So instead of continually bringing them in from another country, it's actually like another good. We can sell the ones that we have for a profit. So there were so many in the South that they weren't necessarily against doing away with the slave trade.